Hello everyone. This is a work page that's been created for Wake Tech faculty in particular to learn how to create, design, and implement podcasts into their online classes. This page will walk them through sort of the specific steps necessary to properly design and implement a podcast. So we're starting here. Each section has been broken down and given its own page. So one for designing podcasts, one for recording and editing, one for ADA compliance, which will look at both federal laws and particular guidelines and requirements that Wake Tech has in place for its faculty. And then we're going to look finally at LMS integration. So how do you actually take that recorded podcast that you've completed and integrate it into whatever LMS you're using? Since this is specifically for Wake Tech faculty, we're going to be focusing on the Blackboard options because that's the LMS that's used here. But this still is applicable even if you're using Moodle or Canvas. So I think pretty much faculty in any institution could benefit from this training, though it is, like I said, specifically kind of focused on Wake Tech faculty. So on the home page here, we just scroll down and we have our basic steps for creating a podcast. So this is sort of just a very brief introduction of the steps that need to be followed in order to properly create and implement a podcast. So we want to plan thoroughly, pre-production, record, post-production, and then publish. And we're going to look at these more as we go into the actual content of the site that's been created to help train faculty on how to do this. So we're going to move here to the first page. We can access it here at the top, or there's also hyperlinked here for designing your podcast. And there is a particular slideshow that's already been created and narrated that gives guidance on how to do this. So you would just watch, if you were training, you would just watch through this, take notes, and kind of follow through as we outline the best way to design and implement best practices for creating a podcast in education specifically. And some of the things that we touch on and some of the major points of this particular slideshow are here, in that to ensure a podcast is successful, you really want to keep in mind that you're effectively integrating it pedagogically into your course. So the podcast itself should have a purpose and a goal. We know that at Wake Tech, the majority of our students are adult learners, and adult learners do best when they know why they're doing something. That's really a huge difference between pedagogy and andragogy, in that adult learners function best when there's relevance, whereas they're not learning just for the sake of learning. They want to know why. How is this going to benefit? So it's really important that you integrate and explain the purpose and function of the podcast. Why are they listening to it? What are you trying to get them to get out of it? And then the incorporation into the students' learning and studying habits. So this is the idea that you're creating your podcast with a sense of purpose, and you're letting students understand the environment that they should be listening to it in. So if you're doing sort of a supplemental podcast that's just sort of highlighting things you already talked about, let them know that. Is this something they can listen to when they're jogging or cleaning the house or doing whatever people do? Or is this a more substantive podcast? Do they need to really sit down, take notes? Are you introducing material for the first time? Let them know and be aware of their studying and learning habits, and be sort of realistic of your expectations of what they're going to get from this podcast. So when you go through, read through this information and then listen to the slideshow here, and this will help you, really design the best podcast that you can deliver to your students. So moving on to recording and editing. So this is really just tips on how to make your podcast and your audio sound as good as you can, and also different options for software that can be used. I tried to give down here options for free software because we don't want to put an undue burden on faculty if the school is unable to provide them with recording software. Wake Tech in particular does provide Adobe Audition, and while that is a great software, it is very complicated. It's actually what professionals use, so it might be a little more than what we expect faculty to really dig into. So I provided some simpler options here that are both free. Both Anchor and Audacity are free. Anchor particularly is a really simple app that can be used. But these are discussed further in the slideshow here, which faculty would go through, take notes, listen to, and then kind of focus on these questions. So what is the purpose of your podcast? Is it necessary for you to have a very crisp and professional production? So obviously we want everything to sound good, but at the same time, you don't want the perfect to be the enemy of the good. So as long as it is clear enough and silent enough in the background, I think students can get through it. You just don't want there to be a lot of background noise or a lot of really fuzzy recording sounds. Do you have the time and professional support to learn a complicated software program like Adobe? If you don't, then there are other options out there. I really think at this point that Audition is something that if you want to take the time to learn, that's great, but it's not necessary anymore. what software do you have access to? So like I said before, Wake Tech pays and provides the Adobe Creative Cloud to the faculty for free, which is a really great boon for us. But not all programs are free, and that's something that you need to consider. And if you're going to use podcasting in your course as a sort of project-based learning, you need to take that into consideration for your students, because you don't want to put an undue financial burden on your students as well. So we really want to look for that free software. And do you have the necessary hardware to record? So if you're using something like Anchor, you really just need your smartphone. Smartphones have come a long way, and you can make a really good production with just your smartphone, the speaker that's built in, and the editing software that comes with the Anchor app. So you may not need something very heavy duty, or if you have access to or already own more advanced, recording hardware, more professional mics and pop filters and things like that, then by all means, use those. But don't feel limited because your home office doesn't look like a professional studio. That's not something that you need to kind of it doesn't need to hold you back. You can still make a very decent podcast for your students even without really advanced software. So after viewing this slideshow and kind of taking these things into consideration, we move on to ADA compliance. So here I have another brief slideshow where I talk about the importance of the Americans with Disabilities Act and how it manifests itself within Wake Tech's own guidelines. We take accessibility and accommodation very seriously here. No recordings should be posted without transcripts into Blackboard. And that's really the major step with making recordings accessible, which is really nice. It's not as complicated as posting a video, where Wake Tech requires that not only do you caption that video, but you also provide a transcript to that video. So that can really put a lot more work onto a faculty member. Whereas if you are creating a podcast, more than likely you already wrote a script. So you can just take that script, turn it into a text file, and you upload it along with your recording into your LMS, and you're done. You've cleared all the hurdles for ADA compliance and in-house compliance here at Wake Tech. Now these standards may vary. Some standards may vary from institution to institution, though the major ADA compliance from the federal law and Section 504 will remain the same. So I put the slideshow here, and I also have links to the federal pages, and then Wake Tech's accessibility homepage and Wake Tech's disability support services. So these are the two main things to keep in consideration for Wake Tech faculty coming into this training. More than likely, they've already been exposed to a lot of this. Like I said, our online training, EPIC, QEP compliance, has a big focus on accessibility anyway. So if a teacher is already teaching online at Wake Tech, they've been exposed to this before. But this is a good reminder and kind of a way to appeal to them that podcasts are really a great way to go about providing different deliverables to your students, because they are so easy to make compliant. You just have to add that transcript. And then finally, after you've designed and recorded your podcast, made sure that you're prepared to make it ADA compliant once you upload it into your LMS. The last thing to do is actually do that, right? Integrate it into your LMS. So here I don't have a separate slideshow. This is the only page that doesn't have a more detailed, in-depth kind of discussion. It's basically just two things. So there are two main methods for publishing a podcast, making it available to students. So within Blackboard, that is. So you want to choose which one is best for you. I really don't think one is better than the other. It just depends on how you're integrating the podcast into the lesson material. So you may just want to put it in here as an audio file, where you would just create an audio option under the Build Content drop-down menu. And I have a screenshot here of what that looks like. And you simply just add the link to the podcast and upload it. It'll put it in a little box, a little audio box. Students can click on that and access it. Another option is if you want to publish your podcast on a podcatcher, which really there is some confusion about how this works. So we know the really big ones, right? Apple iTunes now is Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher. These are really big podcasting platforms. They don't actually host your podcast. They just kind of serve as a middleman. So the way that it works is you publish it, the podcatcher has it, and then you can subscribe and create that RSS feed. This is talked about more in detail in the in the designing your podcast, about actually what makes a podcast as opposed to just an audio file. So that's already been discussed earlier on when you're going through the training. But here, if you do decide to do that, then you'll be given a link that you embed, and students can go ahead and access it that way. And you can do that through the HTML box in the Create an Item option in Blackboard. So doing it this way is really nice, because students can access the actual podcast itself, and they can subscribe to it through the RSS feed. And that means that every time you upload something, your students will automatically get those push notifications that you probably receive on your smartphone for various different things. So they'll know when you upload something. They won't have to seek it out. It will be delivered to them, which is one of the really major attractive things of podcasting and delivering information to students. It's even more convenient for them and for you. However, I would recommend at this stage that if you do, even if you're hosting your stuff through a podcatcher, that you're still, obviously putting it into your LMS because you need to post that transcript for the ADA compliance. So hopefully after faculty go through this website, read all the information, watch all the videos and the slideshows, and kind of create their podcast, they'll be able to not have much trouble. This would be part of the larger training that my department, eSupport and Learning, is doing. So, of course, we would be available for questions, and we'd walk faculty through this, and they would produce a podcast that would be put into their LMS and that we would be looking at as part of our EPIC review. So this is really just something to kind of guide them along the way and answer basic questions.